Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Ream Library, or for some of you, back to Ream Library. We had a wonderful student audience for a transcription workshop, or translation workshop this afternoon, not transcription, this afternoon here in Ream Library, so it's good to see people back. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the College of the Holy Cross. The McFarland Center sponsors an array of campus lectures, discussions, dialogues, and conversations that foster discussion on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. We also sponsor initiatives that foster greater Jewish-Christian understanding and an initiative to enhance our understanding of Catholicism as a global phenomenon. Today, we welcome what I would say is the longest planned event in the history of the McFarland Center. For my own amusement, I was looking back through some of the old emails that took me as far back as our first email about this lecture, which was just shy of 6 years ago. Our speaker and I made a great plan that was to bring her here 5 years ago. Just before that, before she was coming here, we started trading emails, though, about a novel virus that was spreading in the US and wondering how that might affect our plans. And then she wrote me one day to say that indeed Penn was closing down in-person classes and told her she couldn't travel. And I wrote back and said, well, Holy Cross is closing classes too. So when we recounted this to a group of classics students today, though, they said something like, well, bad news for them, good news for us. So here we are. This lecture today that brings us here is part of the Thomas More Lecture in the Humanities, which if anyone wanted to know why did we name a lecture series after Thomas More, it actually has to do with an endowment we received from a school that was called the Thomas More School that wanted to fund a lecture in humanities. So we inherited that, and here we are. The initiative brings together leaders in their academic field to campus to explore ways that the humanities illuminate moral dilemmas, enhance our capacity for understanding and empathy, and help us to imagine more just ways of living. Our speaker today is certainly a leader in her field, in the classics, one whose works our students, I've learned today, know and engage. I'm grateful in particular for Professors Mary Ebbett and Oliver de la Paz, who arranged that seminar and really encouraged us to reopen the conversation, the post-COVID conversation, and to bring Emily back to campus. Emily Wilson comes to us today from the University of Pennsylvania, where she is Department Chair and Professor of Classical Studies. She's the author, translator, or editor of several books, including Mocked to Death, Tragic Overliving from Sophocles to Milton, which was in 2004, The Death of Socrates, Hero, Villain, and Chatterbox, nice title, Chatterbox Saint from 2007, and The Greatest Empire, A Life of Seneca from 2014. She's perhaps best known, though, for translating the works of Homer. In 2018, her translation of Homer's Odyssey became the first by a woman into English verse. Her Odyssey was named by the New York Times as one of the 100 notable books of 2018 and was shortlisted for the National Translation Award. A year later, she was the recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship, and in 2020, she joined the Booker Prize judging panel. That's the one I would want to ask you about most, what that's like. The same year, she was awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship to support her next major work, a translation of Homer's Iliad. That translation was published in 2023. She's been prolific in terms of engaging the literature of Homer and classical literature in general with a larger public audience. So I'm really excited to have her today, and please join me in welcoming Emily Wilson.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here and for sticking with it over the last 6 years of, I guess it wasn't quite the 10-year odyssey, but it was close to that, the journey to come here. So my talk today, I had actually invented this title 6 years ago, so I was scrambling to come up with what I'm going to do for today, which is sort of a fusion of several things. So this is a map of what I'm going to do today. I'm going to start with the beginning of the Iliad. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I approach the project of retranslation, what I think translation is, what it means to retranslate something where there's lots of translations that already exist in the language. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the three of the many ways that Homer is weird from a modern perspective and what a translator might do about that, and sort of sketch some ways that I think you can see modern assumptions playing out in existing translations. Then I'll end with another short reading, and I'm going to try to make sure I keep an eye on the time so I have lots of time for questions from you, because I'd love to hear what you want to ask me. Okay, so I'm going to start just with saying the beginning of the Iliad first in Greek and then in my translation, so that you can sort of hear both what they both sound like, how different they are, because inevitably a translation sounds completely different from the original, and also some of the things I'm trying to lean into in the translation work. Mene naida thea pelea do Achilleos ulamenen. Her muria kaiois algea theca. Polas difthimus psuka saidi proiapsin. Hero on. Autuste heloria chukekunesin. Oio noisite daita. Dios te leto bule. Exudeta prota dieste tenerisanta. Atredes tenaxandron. Kai Dios Achilleus. So now I'm going to do my translation. And so I want people to be clapping primarily for the Greek. I've been hearing about how many people take Greek here. It's wonderful. If you don't yet take Greek, please take Greek, because that demonstrates to you that you can come up with something that everyone will always love. Goddess, sing of the cataclysmic wrath of great Achilles, son of Peleus, that caused the Greeks immeasurable pain and sent so many noble souls of heroes to Hades and made men the spoils of dogs, a banquet for the birds. And so the plan of Zeus unfolded, starting with the conflict between great Agamemnon, lord of men, and glorious Achilles. So as you can hear, my translation is in a different meter from the original, but it has a traditional meter. One of the primary things I wanted to do was provide for Anglophone readers and listeners a translation of the Homeric poems that would use a traditional meter in English, iambic pentameter, and would lean into other sonic qualities in the original, such as alliteration, assonance, and would also lean into the proto-dramatic qualities of the original. The reason I ham it up with the hand gestures is that I think that actually is part of what the experience of Homer in antiquity would have been like. Not necessarily those same hand gestures, but the performability is an essential element in what these poems are. So I just want to talk a little bit about translation in general. In general, translation always, whether it's a great ancient epic poem or a menu or a shampoo bottle, it's always about interpretation. And it always, to do it halfway competently, you have to be reasonably fluent in the idioms, both of the language you're translating from and the one you're translating into. If you don't have a reasonable level of fluency in both, and think about how to write an idiom that might be strange in your language from another language, you're going to mess up in terms of how do you create the same effect as the original. When we, meaning classes professors or people who teach any kinds of any language, including ancient languages, are grading exams, having taught a language class, we're looking out for, did they understand the tense of the verb? Did they understand the syntax? Did they get what the subject was? In the case of published literary translations, whether it's of contemporary poetry or fiction or of ancient literature, the range of differences between what's out there, if there's a text with multiple translations, is usually not about this translator is competent and this one didn't do her homework. It's usually more about what are the different range of possible interpretations that someone who's fluent in both English and whatever the other language is might do. It's not that Picasso was lying about himself when he chose to do the Cubist approach, and then all of a sudden he was telling the truth when he was in his blue period. It's that there were all of these possible ways of painting a portrait of Picasso are telling different truths. And multiple retranslations of the same text by translators who are all reasonably competent can be thought of in something like those ways, or like different performances of the same score, or different performances of the same play. I also think that within classical studies, there are particular blocks to thinking about translation throughout our very monolingual culture. Most people don't think about other languages very much because most people don't know any other language in the US. Some people, of course, do. Many people are bilingual. In the case of classics, there are particular impediments to thinking about translation as a way of evoking a whole experience. If the original text is a whole experience, you want to recreate that experience. The way we teach Latin and ancient Greek inculcates an idea that those languages are not like that. And what you try to learn in Latin class or ancient Greek class is how to solve this weird kind of crossword puzzle. And you can get good at the crossword puzzle, and you look things up in the dictionary and plot things, substitute your own clunky words that you've understood the syntax from, and you produce something that is not actually like English or like Latin. But then you turn it in, and the teacher gives you an A, and you scored. So the translate the passage above as literally as possible uses the word translate to mean, show me that you understood this. Whereas the AP Spanish or French exams ask questions that invite you to demonstrate your fluency. I think we should try to think through how can we convey to students, even at the beginning level, the goal here is fluency. The goal here is not crossword puzzles. Because I think that actually affects both acquisition of the languages and also how do we think about published translations and what they're doing. They're not actually trying to demonstrate their homework to a teacher who doesn't exist. In general, in my priorities in translation, I think one has to think through what the priorities are, because a translator can never do everything. And you have to start the project knowing this is fundamentally impossible, and yet there are some things that I might be able to do. Some kinds of likeness I might be able to achieve. I'm never going to have total likeness because I'm writing a completely different language in a completely different literary culture. I focus on things like sound, things like multiplicity of moods and voices. All of the texts I've published translations of have been performance texts, including plays, but also including Homer. I try to think through the specificity of the particular style, the particular author, the particular passage, the particular line. I try and think a lot about pacing. With the Odyssey translation, I limited myself to the same number of lines as the original because I felt that one of the big things that many of the translations that I'd used with my students were missing was a sense of how exciting and pacey and tell me more, the feeling of reading Homer in Greek is. A translator is always going to be tempted to add more words because there's never an exact equivalent between this word in Greek or any language and this word in English. So you always think, well, I could do 50 different things here, so let me just put down 5 different words for that one, cover all my bases. But then you end up with a translation that's way longer and gets the students to have the impression that Homer is boring because the translation has too many words. Homer isn't boring, so pacing matters. And if the original text feels slow, ideally I think the translation should do that too. So in thinking about the project of whether it would be worthwhile for me to spend the last 12 years or however long I spent doing these new translations of Homer, I thought through my experiences with my students, and I thought through what already exists in 20th and 21st century English that general readers can use to gain an experience of Homer. I felt that one of the big things that was missing, as I already suggested, was meter. Most of them don't use any kind of traditional regular meter. That seems to me essential to what Homer in Greek feels like, sounds like. There are several different sort of styles that became standard in 20th and 21st century Homeric translations. Some of them prioritize echoing the original word order, even when that sounds weird in English. Others make it sound very chatty, very slangy, in ways that I think aren't quite echoing the formal and poetic and not quite like regular speech qualities of the Homeric poems. This is a famous line from Victor Hugo that when you offer a translation to a nation, that nation will almost always look on the translation as an act of violence to itself. I think translation should be an act of violence. There should be a sense of the translation can trouble the relationship between the familiar and the strange. If a translation of if a retranslation doesn't feel troubling in any way, it's not doing its job. There should be something that startles you about a translation, whether it's a retranslation or but maybe especially if it's a retranslation. It should invite you to think again about something you thought you knew. There's a common trope in translation theory is the impetus to always foreignize as much as possible, though with the acknowledgement that translation is inherently a domesticizing project. You're not transcribing the original. And if you were, it would be completely pointless if you haven't taught the reader to read the language. I think the idea that using foreignizing in the sense of archaizing English is going to get you closer to the ancient Greeks is actually false. That there are ways that that can confirm prejudices about what does antiquity sound like. It's going to sound oldie-timey and unreadable and boring because, of course, people weren't fully human until about 1950. It has this sort of whole sort of provincialism in the way that people may tend to think about antiquity, and that if there's too much incomprehensibility or unreadability, it can actually work not to defamiliarize, but it sounds familiar, because those are the expectations we may already bring to antiquity. So this is a list of some of the central features of Homeric poetics, which I've already, in a way, touched on, so I won't pause here. I think if one approaches translation and also approaches ancient literature with the sense that one essential reason to do it, one essential reason both to produce translations and to walk through them with students, to teach these texts, to read these texts, is that they are fundamentally strange to us, then we may find new places of familiarity, and that there may be a reorientation in terms of what feels familiar, what feels strange. That might be different now from the way it was even 20 years ago or even 6 years ago. So I have the theme in the Odyssey of the journey back in time to past greatness, the fears of cultural diversity and inclusivity and equity. Those things have a new kind of resonance in our culture now. If I'd been giving this talk 6 years ago, I wouldn't have said, the real thing about the Iliad is it begins with a medical crisis, which produces a political crisis. And that's what the poem has always been about. But it's much more obvious now that that's what the poem's about. Okay, so I'm going to just walk through 3 sort of central ways that the Homeric poems, I'm actually going to focus just on the Iliad, are strange from a modern perspective, and I'm going to talk about a particular passage with each of them, but with the first one, I'll sort of talk a little bit in general first. I think one of the fundamental ways that the Homeric poems are strange is the way that human beings in Homer are consistently human beings, even when they're dead, and even when they're enacting what we may see as terrible, cruel acts of violence. In both of those instances, Homer depicts those characters as still fully human. What Priam gets back at the end of the Iliad is not the corpse of Hector, it's Hector. What Achilles is doing on the battlefield is not turning into something inhuman. He's still Achilles. He's still a human being, albeit a son of a goddess. So I just wanted to show you how I think there's a temptation in translation to back away from some of those types of strangeness. So for instance, in the passage I just performed for you in the proem of the Iliad, we have this distinction between the psychos of the heroon, that the spirits or souls of the warriors who are dead, and then the autus, the characters themselves are what's being eaten by the dogs and the birds. The tendency in translation, of course, is to suggest this is going to fit into a Cartesian or Christian soul-body binary. So it's the souls that are going to Hades, and it's only the bodies that are getting eaten by the dogs and the birds. That makes a huge difference to what we think is happening and how much it matters if what's being eaten is the people themselves, rather than just the bodies of the people themselves. So I used souls of heroes and contrasted that with men, because it's the men who are being eaten. I have a whole lot to say about Simone Weil, which I'm not going to share with you mostly because I realize that I have too much to say for this talk, but I wanted to bring her in as a super influential but also and fascinating figure in herself, and also I think kind of interestingly influential in particular about the way that she reads the Iliad and the way that she misreads the Iliad. When I talk to sort of general audiences about Homer and specifically about the Iliad, people very often bring up, oh, but have you read Simone Weil? Have you read Simone Weil? In a sort of very worshipful way, because of course she is a secular saint, and perhaps also a religious saint in certain ways. I think it's possible for somebody to be totally admirable in their life and also be literary critically wrong. And I think she is literary critically wrong about the Iliad. She insists in her essay on the Iliad that the real hero of the poem is force, which is as pitiless to the man who possesses it or thinks he does as to its victims. The second it crushes, the first it intoxicates. So she has this whole account of force as this power that creates a kind of mechanistic machine and a kind of totalitarian mechanistic or post-industrial machine out of what were once human beings on the battlefield. She also has some extraordinary claims where she's searching for proto-Christian kinds of heroes who can be gentle and praiseworthy and show some signs of grace. So she fixates on Patroclus, who, quote, throughout the Iliad commits no cruel or brutal act. Patroclus actually has one of the very highest kill counts of all of the Homeric heroes, which is because he's a very important character. The Homeric poems demonstrate the importance of particular characters by how many people are they able to kill successfully in the course of their Aristeia. Patroclus shares with Achilles a love of killing. That's one of the many things that they have in common. It's maybe the deepest thing that they have in common. So I think it's interesting that Vi has this attitude, and I think not just because of her, but in general, because of the way we experience violence and also experience the post-industrial authoritarian world. We have a tendency to think what's happening in those battle sequences in the Iliad is something dehumanizing is happening. Achilles is turning into a robot. Agamemnon must be somehow less than a human being when he's chopping people's heads off. And it seems to me that those characters in those Aristeia scenes are not depicted as dehumanized. They may be like a natural force, but they're still human beings, and they're not like robots. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about two other translations of this passage in which Achilles is returning to the battlefield. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I want to make sure we have enough time for discussion, but we can come back to any elements of the passage that people are interested in. I want to just flag that the Greek compares Achilles to a God-ignited fire and to a daimon. So he's like a divine being, and he's like a fire. And he has a particular, very human kind of motivation. He wants to win kudos. So this is the Richmond Lattimore translation. I won't read the whole thing, but I want to just pick up on a few elements that I think are interesting in the approach to translation that Lattimore has. So to look back at Thespidaes pur, so it's God-ignited fire. In Lattimore, it's inhuman fire. And instead of daimon, which is a divine spirit, Achilles is like something more than mortal. It seems to me that those translation choices arguably present us with an Achilles who's not godlike and yet still human, but something that isn't even human or divine. He's acting somehow on impulse. I think there were also ways that the clunkiness of the Lattimore translation contribute to a sense of there's something robotic about the action here. We have these repetitions that don't correspond to repetitions in the Greek, like the chariot at the start of one line, another the chariot. Then we have feet, foot, feet, which is also really weird English, because usually horses have hooves and not feet. But the presentation of these horses as going on feet sort of slows you down and slows down the action, and arguably confuses you about who is the human being here. Actually, it's Achilles, and it's always Achilles who's the human being in this scene. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about the Robert Fagel's translation, which is extremely different in style, of course, and different in terms of just how many English idioms Fagel's introduces. But it has some elements that I think are similar. And of course, Fagel's has very obviously looked at some other translations and borrowed the inhuman fire from Lattimore. He introduces far more instances of the word blood than the corresponding Greek. Fagel's very often wants to amp up the melodrama. So an easy way to amp up the excitement and melodrama in any scene is to have the word blood a lot. But I also want us to focus on the way that I think it's interesting how in this passage, before thinking about where might we see signs of dehumanization in translation. I hadn't thought about this passage of Fegel's in quite this way, but it's interesting to me that he chooses to repeat the word on in English so many times, which doesn't correspond to anything in the Greek. So thundering on, heaped on, rampaged on, charioteering on. I think there's like one or two more. Storming on, raging on. So there's a lot of sense of this is the heroic killer as Energizer Bunny. I think that the ons sort of suggest this momentum which keeps going on and on and on. You couldn't possibly stop it. As opposed to what I think the Greek is suggesting is he still wants to go. And he is a human being with desires. And he has that still desire to aresthai his kudos. So I'll just read my version of that passage. As fire from heaven rages through deep glens on a parched mountainside, and forests burn, and wind whirls everywhere, and whips the flames, Achilles with his spear swept everywhere, pursuing those he killed. The ground flowed black with blood, as when a farmer yokes 2 oxen with flat, broad faces, so that he can garner white barley in a well-built threshing floor. They bellow as they work, and soon the grain is turned to husks beneath their hooves. Just so the strong-hoofed horses, driven by Achilles, trampled the shields and corpses, and the axle beneath the chariot was doused in blood, as were the rails around it. They were spattered by droplets from the wheels and horses' hooves. Achilles, son of Peleus, still yearned to win himself more glory and success. His lethal hands were always drenched in gore. So I think one can hear how horrifying that passage is if you're one of the people being trampled beneath the chariot wheels, but you can also see that the person driving is still a person, even while he's doing these things, and that he's not either dehumanized or mechanized in the process of that. So my second sort of general category is that I think in general, Homer has extraordinarily broad sympathies. The Homeric poet has extraordinarily broad sympathies. And that the primary warrior characters aren't presented as, of course, you're only going to care about Achilles, you won't care about anyone else. You'll only care about Hector, you won't care about anyone else. Rather, these poems repeatedly present us with characters facing off against each other in a sort of prototype for the Athenian tragic model of the agone. But in those scenes, we always get a sense of this is this character's perspective and voice, this is that character's perspective and voice. It's never just one way. There's always the killers and the killed. A sort of basic point is that Heros is not hero. These characters are heroic warriors, heroic in the sense that there were hero cults to them, but not heroic in the sense of we're supposed to think everything they did was great. And of course, scholars and translators, in theory, know this, but I think there are ways that it doesn't necessarily always come through in translation. I wanted just to give a nod to Simone Weil's contemporary, Rachel Bespaloff, who also wrote really interestingly about the Iliad, and to suggest that her way of reading the character of Hector as an absolutely idealized hero of la résistance, which is, of course, was relevant to her own context, doesn't necessarily fit everything about the poem, including doesn't necessarily fit the ways that Hector pursues his own kleos at the expense of protecting his city. Within the basic narrative of the poem, we're shown a character who acknowledges that in his insistence on leaving home, leaving his wife and child behind, and leaving his family, despite the pleas of his wife to fight more defensively and safely on the wall, he's prioritizing his own kleos and the avoidance of shame, rather than whatever other military strategy he could adopt. It's not about saving Troy or fighting for the resistance. Okay, so I'm just going to talk a tiny bit about this passage in which I think it's interesting to see how translators sometimes seem to me to somewhat sentimentalize the relationship between Hector and Andromache and suggest that Hector is always being super sweet to Andromache, and if she's a little bit upset, that's just because she's a girl, and it can't possibly be that he's doing anything objectively upsetting in this scene. So I would point to, this is the Richmond Lattimore translation of that passage. In this exchange, Andromache first uses the word daimonia, which is cognate with daimon, could suggest strange, could suggest God-blessed, could suggest there's something weird about you right now. It could, commentators suggest maybe it's sometimes used just as a token of affection between husband and wife, because it seems to come up repeatedly between husband and wife, but it etymologically seems to suggest you're being weird right now. It seems to me really interesting that in several of the translations I've looked at, translators translate that word differently when it's Andromache versus when it's Hector. So when Andromache is speaking to Hector, I can't now remember what Lattimore has, but it's certainly not poor Hector, because Andromache is not imagined to be pitying Hector, whereas Hector is pitying Andromache. In this crucial phrase of, why does your heart sorrow so much for me? It seems to me that that suggests in the reading of the Greek dative moi that Hector thinks Andromache is crying because she's going to be sad that Hector will die, as opposed to also being sad their baby will be killed and she will be enslaved for the rest of her life. So it seems to me that the use of that dative is potentially could suggest more than just you will be sad because I will be dead. And so translations can either allow for that possibility or not allow for that possibility. I would also suggest that, again, there are ways that Lattimore's uses of repetitions that don't correspond to repetitions in the Greek can produce a distancing effect. So here we have see to it, the men must see to it, as if there's this really distanced approach to anything that anyone is doing. Maybe it's just inadvertent clunkiness, but I think the effect is that there's no sense of anyone being sort of fully immersed in their work, whether it's the work of the battlefield or the work of the household. I also think there's something really interesting about the very weird and foreignizing translation of the thalaron dacru at the end of the passage, the live tears fall. Which again, I think the effect of that, whether or not it's deliberate, is arguably to suggest Andromache's tears are incomprehensible. There's this weird set of water falling from her face. Live tears, it's kind of freaky. But luckily, she's getting far away from Hector, and he's going to be able to avoid it soon. Maybe that's overreading, but it seems to me that it's really weird, and notably weird. The Robert Fagles translation, I just want to flag maybe two things out of it. One is that he does the same things in terms of translating daimonia, daimonios, daimonia, differently for the husband versus the wife, and again seems to suggest that he doesn't want Hector to be being too mean to Andromache in this moment when he's giving her the brush off. So he has Andromache, dear one, for daimonia, which of course makes it sound like he's a loving husband. Don't worry, dear reader. It's not like he's being mean to her. He's saying dear one, so why is she even crying? It has the same thing of grief for me, and it also has an addition, which I think is a really interesting addition, of please. So please go home. He's being much nicer than the Greek Hector is being. And he copies from Lattimore the weird, freaky tears, which again I think helped to make us feel that she's really weird for crying. I don't think she's weird for crying. I don't think he's weird for leaving, but I don't think she's weird for crying. And I think they both think the other is strange, and that the estrangement between them is essential in the passage, and that the listener of the passage should be able to fully understand both perspectives, rather than have the whole passage be focalized primarily through Hector's perspective, as opposed to letting us see both. So I was going to read my translation of that passage. Strange woman, come on now. You must not be too sad on my account. No man can send me to the house of Hades before my time. No man can get away from destiny, first set for us at birth, however cowardly or brave he is. Go home and do the things you have to do. Work on your loom and spindle, and instruct the slaves to do their household work as well. War is a task for men, for every man born here in Troy, but most especially me. When he had finished speaking, glorious Hector picked up his helmet with its horsehair plume. His loving wife set off for home, but kept twisting and turning back to look at him. More and more tears kept flooding down her face. Okay, so I'm going to do final case study, and I wasn't exactly sure which category to put this in. Primarily, it's actually a case study which is about idioms and metaphors. So this is a passage later in the Iliad, where Achilles has been, as you all know, refusing to fight because of his semi-divine, quasi-divine menace against Agamemnon. And as a result of that fury, he's turned against all of his fellow Greeks and begged his sea goddess mother Thetis to ensure that he can regain glory by the very paradoxical means of not fighting. So typically, Homeric heroes gain glory by fighting, and typically you gain glory by killing people on the other side. And Achilles manages to accrue glory by not fighting, not moving his swift feet, just being like Ken in the Barbie movie, doing beach, sitting there. But then, of course, he realizes 3/4 of the way through the poem that when he said he didn't care about any of the Greeks, there was actually one Greek that he did care about, and Patroclus has begged to go in Achilles' stead as his second self, and inevitably, but heartbreakingly, has been killed. So this is Achilles in his burrito form expressing his grief. And I guess one of the other things that, of course, is essential for any translation of this passage is to convey how emotionally intense it is, how emotionally intense the speaker's state of mind is, and how that ought to land with a listener or a reader as well. Tende barus denakon prosefer podosukus Achilles, metere me, tamenar moja lumpio sexetelesen. Alla timoi ton hedos, epe philos olethetairos, Patroclos, ton ego peripanton tion hetairon, ison me kephale, ton apolesa. So it needs to be emotionally intense. There are also a whole lot of sonic things going on in how Achilles talks there. Panton, tion, hetairon. There are sound patterns that also go along with the combination of rage, guilt, grief that the speaker is expressing. There are also questions about how do you do double meanings in translation. Tonapolasa, I lost him or I destroyed him. In this case, it's obviously both. And it seems like it really matters that it's both. Sometimes you can easily decide which is it more. But in this case, Achilles is the one who sent Patroclus out wearing his armor because he was refusing to fight himself. Is there a level of Achilles feeling guilty as well as overwhelmed by guilt in this passage? Is there a way to find an English word that magically means exactly the same as the Greek word? I kind of don't think there is. Achilles says, I loved him isona me kephale, which obviously means I loved him like a second self. I loved him very much. He was very dear to me. My head is actually a really important body part to me, which I can't live without. So there's a way of saying that. And we don't in English usually say, I love you so much. I love you like my head. What we do say in English is a very distracting, different idiom. I've lost my head. That's not what Achilles is saying. He's not saying, I've gone crazy. He's saying, I've lost what was most important, which is something that's equal to my head. So then do you just skip the metaphor? That's a possibility, which, as I'll show you in a second, most translators go for. I think that's also a huge cost because, so this is part of where I'm going with weirdness. Sometimes the weird metaphor might feel like it's actually essential. And then the question is, how do you make it both weird but also comprehensible for an Anglophone reader? It seems to me that in a poem where we've had quite a lot of literal decapitations, especially with the Aristeia of Agamemnon, who loves cutting people's heads off, it actually matters that Achilles is going to be entering the battlefield as if he has no head, and that it's as if he's not just lost some minor body part, he's lost almost the whole of himself, and yet he's still running around and being fully human, as I just argued, despite having no head. So I'm just going to show you very quickly a few approaches to that little passage. This is from the first complete published translation into English by the great verse dramatist George Chapman into rhyming for teeners. You can see, I just comment on a couple of things in each. I won't comment on everything. One could easily spend a whole hour on almost any passage of any translation because it's so interesting. I just want to point out that Chapman very often imports some interestingly Christianizing and stoicizing language into his translations of both the Iliad and the Odyssey. He had a whole account of the Odyssey as the journey of the soul towards divine grace. He's trying to do similar things with the Iliad and also framing the Iliad in terms of the Earl of Essex rebellion and revenge tragedy and so on. There's a whole lot of things going on in the cultural background. Here you can see how he has the word grace, which seems, from a modern perspective, and also, I would argue, from an ancient Greek perspective, radically different from anything that Olympian Zeus would ever show. Olympian Zeus does not do grace at all. But Chapman's one does. The Pope translation into rhyming couplets is wonderful and has various, in any passage you can find some wonderful phrases that are completely made up by Pope and don't correspond to anything in the Greek. In this case, like the idea of cureless grief, I think is wonderful. I don't see it in the Greek. Revenge itself is lost is a wonderful phrase, very, very abstract and very un-Homeric, I think. And you can see how both of these don't have any head. They have a sense of what's lost is the self. Now we're zooming forward in time. I skipped the 19th century, even though there were many interesting 19th century examples. This is the prose translation in the Loeb Library. And what I wanted to flag in this is the way that in the Greek, Achilles is podos orcus Achilleus. So the epithet goes first, and then we have the name. That's natural English word order. But then lo and behold, the Greek has Achilles, comma, swift of foot. So there are clearly reasons beyond echoing the word order of the original that are guiding the translation choices of these translators. And the reasons have to do with making it sound archaic and oldie-timey in English. And those reasons sometimes are stylistically trumping the other priority of try to echo the Greek word order at least a little bit, though in fact you mostly can't do it because the syntax of English doesn't typically allow it. The other thing I want to flag here, which I could have flagged with all of these, is that there's a real dilemma about how to translate tion, which could connote loved, valued, honored, respected. What kind of relationship do Achilles and Patroclus have? That's kind of a crucial verb at this moment. The verb goes with honored, so it's very much a workplace relationship. This is the Lattimore translation, which I just want to note that it does the exact same thing as the verb in terms of flipping the word order, even though that doesn't reflect the Greek. And I also want to note the way that Lattimore very often introduces abstractions where there isn't an abstraction in the Greek. So we have this idea of brought to accomplishment for something which just, it's a single verb, achieve this. So it makes it sound metaphysically confusing in some way. What is it to bring to accomplishment things if what you actually mean is killed a lot of people? And then also notice that there's no head here. So similar patterns in the Fegel's translation of this passage. There's again an addition of dear, which I think is a really interestingly, there are several moments in Fegel's where the Greek doesn't have anything equivalent to dear, but he tones it down and softens it so that the speaker can't be as rude or as brusque as he might be in the original. So he adds in a dear mother, because of course Achilles is being kind of mean to his mom, who tried so hard to help him. But what can he do? And then he also adds in a cliche metaphor, the burning desires, which of course is a friendly gesture to the Anglophone reader. We know what burning desires are, and the Greek doesn't have burning desires. That's not the Greek metaphor. There's a different metaphor, which is the head thing, which he doesn't have. Some of the moves in the Caroline Alexander translation are, I think, very similar to the moves that we've already seen in the Lattimore, so I won't pause on that. So I was going to read my version of that same passage. Swift-footed Lord Achilles, groaning, answered, "Yes, mother, Zeus has granted me that prayer, but now what good to me is any of it? My friend Patroclus, whom I loved, is dead. I loved him more than any other comrade. I loved him like my head, my life, myself. I lost him, killed him." So I chose that passage partly because I think it shows the impossibility of sticking to all of your priorities at the same time. So, I mean, I see this, and almost any passage I could choose is an example of how I failed in terms of fulfilling all of my possible priorities. I wanted to prioritize emotional impact. I wanted to prioritize the metaphors, even if they're weird. I wanted to prioritize double meanings and psychological complexity, if it's there in the Greek. I also wanted to prioritize pacing. So I saw it as a kind of failure that I couldn't do tona polasa with a single pair with just two words in English. I had to do I lost him, killed him, because there isn't a word that means both those things in English. And similarly, I felt there was no way to get across both it's the head And also, this is what this means without you having to look at the endnotes, which I do not want you to do at this moment. I want you to be immersed in this moment, that I had to use more words. So I think it's actually, this is just one of many possible examples one can give of the particular ways that translation is difficult/impossible, because you can have a whole set of priorities, but then carrying them out all at the same time, I don't know how you can possibly do that. Okay, so I'm going to finish with doing a final reading just from the final meeting of Priam and Achilles from almost the end of the Iliad. We often think of the Odyssey as the poem about homecoming, strangers, recognitions, hospitality, and the Iliad as the poem about rage, grief, war. But of course, the opposite is also true, and the poems sort of invite you to listen to them, read them together as complements. The Odyssey is the one that ends with families and communities' grief, and with a scene of intense fighting, which seems like it's never going to stop until Athena finally puts a stop to Odysseus in his killing rampage. The Iliad, by contrast, but also complementarily, ends with scenes of hospitality and homecoming. Hector, who's repeatedly left home in the course of the poem, finally has his nostos after death to be cared for by his family. Achilles becomes finally able to act as a host, both during the games in Book 23, where he's sort of hosting and handing out prizes to assuage the possibilities of deadly conflict among his fellow Greeks, and also most extraordinarily in Book 24, when he's able to act as a host, welcoming a stranger in need to his weird little house, his battlefield encampment, recognizing a version of his own grief and his own father in the person of his guest. Recognition between strangers is a theme resonant with the work of translation, in which the translator is constantly working to find points of connection across vast gulfs of difference. The encounter between antiquity and modernity can feel transformative, I hope, in both directions. In this profound scene, Achilles recognizes Priam's grief and humanity, and also recognizes his own limitations, his mortality, his imminent death. The old man is the same age as his own father, whom he'll never see again because he's going to soon be dead himself, killed by another of Priam's sons. Priam recognizes the humanity of Achilles, the invader who's killed so many of his sons, and sees a version of his own grief reflected in the grief of the man who caused him so much pain. The scene wouldn't work nearly as deeply if it were sentimentalized or idealized. We know that the encounter could, at any moment, erupt in violence. Achilles could kill Priam. That's clearly a possibility within the scene. And we also are constantly reminded this is a teensy little pause in a war that's going to continue and become ever more savage after the poem ends. The city of Troy will fall, the women will be enslaved, the baby will get thrown from the city walls. It's not about making peace. What's strange in this profound scene, what causes thambos or wonder, is the recognition that you can find temporary connection or familiarity even in the most distant of strangers. As readers of Homer, in a strange and distant time, I think we too can find in these poems that combination of strangeness and connection that can lead to amazement. Tus delath eselthon priamos megas, ankidarastas kersin Achilleos labagunata, kai kusakeras, denas, androphonus, hai hoi poleas tenanhuias. He had just finished with his food and wine. The table was still at his side. Great Priam came in unnoticed. He stood near Achilles and touched his knees and kissed his hands, the terrible, murderous hands, which killed so many sons. As when delusion seizes hold of someone who kills a man in his own fatherland and comes to a community of strangers and goes inside the house of a rich man, and everyone who sees him there is shocked. So was Achilles shocked when he saw Priam appearing like a god. So were the others. Startled, they glanced at one another. Priam spoke to Achilles, and this was his prayer. "Godlike Achilles, think of your own father, who was as old as I am, standing over the final threshold between age and death. The people in the neighboring estates probably threaten him, and there is no one to save him from the danger of destruction. And yet, at least he hears you are alive, and so his heart is glad, and every day he hopes to see his own beloved son come home from Troy. Well, I have been the most unlucky man alive. In spacious Troy I had the finest sons, of whom not one is left. I had just one who kept our town and people safe, and you killed him a short while ago, Hector, while he was fighting for his fatherland. I came here to your ships for him, to ransom him from you. I brought with me a countless ransom. Please, Achilles, show reverence towards the gods and pity me, remembering your father Peleus. I am more pitiable than him. I have endured what no man yet on earth has done. I pressed my mouth into the hand of him who killed my son. This made Achilles yearn to mourn his father. With his hand he gently took hold of the old man and pushed him back. Then both remembered those whom they had lost. Curled in a ball beside Achilles' feet, Priam sobbed desperately for murderous Hector. Achilles wept at times for his own father, and sometimes for Patroclus. So their wailing suffused the house. Thank you.